Jimi Hendrix had never played open G tuning before in his life. Keith Richards was watching. And what Jimi played in the first 10 seconds made Keith question everything he thought he knew about the guitar. London. December 1967. A basement rehearsal space in Soho that belonged to nobody in particular, and everyone who needed it. The kind of room that smelled like cigarette smoke and wood polish and years of music that had seeped into the walls. It was 3 in the morning. The session upstairs had ended hours ago, but 5 people remained: Jimi Hendrix, Keith Richards, 2 session musicians whose names time would forget, and a sound engineer named Colin who was there only because he'd lost track of when his shift ended. They'd been playing for hours. Trading riffs. Sharing techniques. The kind of late-night exploration that happens when ego dissolves just enough to let curiosity through. Keith had been showing Jimi some Robert Johnson passages, the Delta blues foundations that the Stones had built their sound upon. Jimi listened with his eyes half closed, nodding occasionally, his fingers absently tracing patterns on his own guitar that sat across his lap. He didn't play along. He never did when someone else was demonstrating. He just absorbed. Keith finished a phrase, let the last note hang in the air, then looked at Jimi. You ever mess with open G? Jimi opened his eyes fully. No. The word hung there. Simple. Complete. No apology. No explanation. Keith's eyebrows raised slightly. In 1967, Jimi Hendrix was already a legend. The man who'd lit his guitar on fire at Monterey. The man who'd redefined what an electric guitar could do. And he'd never played in open G tuning. You're joking, Keith said, but his tone suggested he knew Jimi wasn't. Never needed to, Jimi said quietly. There was no arrogance in it. Just fact. Jimi Hendrix played in standard tuning because standard tuning gave him everything he needed. He'd built entire universes in EDGB. Why would he need anything else? Keith smiled. Not the smile of someone who'd found weakness. The smile of someone who'd just been handed an opportunity. Want to try? Jimi looked at Keith's guitar, a worn acoustic that had seen better days but still held its tuning like a promise. Show me. Hendrix didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. Keith picked up the guitar and demonstrated the tuning. He loosened the 6th, 5th, and 1st strings, bringing them down to DG-DG-BD. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency. This was his home tuning, the foundation of half the Stones' catalog. There, Keith said, strumming an open chord that rang clear and ancient. Open G. Take out the low E entirely if you want. That's how I do it. 5 strings. Pure. He played a simple progression. The bones of honky-tonk women. Before it had words, before it had a name. Just the elemental structure of the blues as it had existed before electricity, before amplification, before everything. Jimi watched Keith's fingers. Watched the spaces between the notes. Watched the way Keith's wrist barely moved but the whole guitar seemed to breathe. Keith finished and held the guitar out. Your turn. Jimi took it. The exchange was slow, deliberate. Keith didn't let go immediately. For just a moment, both men held the instrument between them, and something unspoken passed through the wood and strings. Then Jimi had it. He sat back on his stool, the guitar resting naturally against his body. His left hand found the neck. His fingers touched the strings with that same gentle certainty they always had, like he was greeting old friends, not learning a new language. The 2 session musicians had stopped their own conversation. Colin the engineer looked up from the tape machine he'd been pretending to organize. Everyone in that basement room understood, on some instinct level, that they were about to witness something. Keith leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, waiting. He wasn't testing Jimi. Not really. But there was curiosity there. Open G was his territory. His sanctuary. The tuning that had given him Jumpin' Jack Flash, and Street Fighting Man, and a dozen other songs that had defined a generation. How would Jimi Hendrix, a man who never touched this tuning, approach it? Jimmy's eyes closed. His head tilted slightly, like he was listening to something only he could hear. His right hand hovered over the strings. Then he played. The first note was an open strum. Simple. Testing. Jimmy let it ring out, let it fill the room, let it tell him what this tuning wanted to say. The second note was a bend on the third string. Subtle. Just a quarter tone. But it changed everything. It took the blues Keith had shown him and asked it a question it had never been asked before. The third note was a harmonic. Jimmy's finger barely touched the 12th fret, and a bell-like tone emerged that shouldn't have been possible on an acoustic guitar in a basement room at 3 in the morning. By the 5th note, Keith's arms had uncrossed. By the 8th note, Keith's mouth had opened slightly. By the 10th note, Keith Richards, one of the finest guitarists of his generation, the man who mastered open G tuning and built a career on its foundations, had gone completely silent. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. What Jimmy was playing defied category. It wasn't blues, though blues was in there. It wasn't rock, though rock was its backbone. It wasn't jazz, though jazz informed every choice. It was none of those things and all of those things and something else entirely. Something that had no name because no one had done it before. Jimmy's fingers moved across the fretboard like they'd known this tuning their entire life. Sliding. Bending. Finding harmonics in places harmonics shouldn't exist. Creating rhythms that seemed impossible with one guitar and two hands. But it was more than technique. It was the spaces. The silences. The notes Jimmy chose not to play. Every 3 or 4 bars, Jimmy would pause. Just for a beat. Just long enough for the room to breathe. And in those pauses you could hear what he just said, could feel it settling into the walls, into the floor, into everyone listening. Keith stood frozen against the wall. His own guitar hung loosely in one hand, completely forgotten. His face showed something rare for Keith Richards. Uncertainty. Not about Jimmy, about himself. Because what Jimmy was doing wasn't just playing open G. It was understanding it. Completely. Instantly. And then transcending it. The session musicians had stopped pretending not to stare. Colin the engineer had abandoned all pretense of working and was simply standing there, mouth open, watching. Jimmy played for maybe 90 seconds. Maybe 2 minutes. Time had stopped meaning anything. Then he hit a final chord, a complex voicing that used all 6 strings in a way that should have been physically impossible in open G tuning, and let it sustain. The note hung in the basement air, vibrating through the cigarette smoke, bouncing off the old walls, refusing to die. When it finally faded, Jimmy opened his eyes. Keith was staring at him. The room held its breath. In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. Jimmy looked down at the guitar in his hands. Then he looked at Keith. "You play this every day?" His voice was quiet. Genuinely curious. No performance. No awareness of what he'd just done. Keith managed to nod. "Feels good," Jimmy said. He strummed the open chord once more. "Feels honest." He held the guitar out to Keith. "Thank you for showing me." Keith took the instrument back like he was accepting something sacred. His hands were shaking slightly, something he'd hide for years afterward, something only the 4 other people in that room would ever know. "How did you?" Keith started then stopped. The question was too big. Too complicated. "How did you do that? How did you understand in 2 minutes what took me years? How are you possible?" Jimmy smiled. It wasn't a smug smile. It was the smile of someone who genuinely didn't understand what the fuss was about. "You showed me the tuning. The guitar showed me the rest." One of the session musicians, a bass player named Terry who'd played on dozens of records and thought he'd seen everything, whispered to his partner. "Did that just fucking happen?" Colin the engineer had his hand over his mouth. He'd been recording. He'd captured it on tape. And 30 years later, he'd still be trying to explain to people what had happened in that room, why it mattered, why the silence after Jimi stopped playing was louder than any applause. Keith set his guitar down carefully. He pulled out a cigarette, lit it with hands that had steadied somewhat, and took a long drag. Then he looked at Jimi and said something that no one in that room ever forgot. "I've been playing open G for 8 years," Keith said quietly. "I thought I knew it. I thought I'd found everything it could do." He paused. "You just showed me I've been speaking it with an accent this whole time." Jimi tilted his head, considering. "No. You speak it true. That's your voice. What I just did, that's just me hearing what you said and trying to say it back. My accent is different. Your accent," Keith said, "is from somewhere I've never been." The two men looked at each other. It wasn't confrontation. It wasn't competition. It was recognition. Keith Richards was one of the finest guitarists alive. He knew it. The world knew it. And in that basement room, Jimi Hendrix had just shown him, gently, without ego, almost apologetically, that there were still mountains he hadn't climbed. Territories he hadn't imagined. And Keith could either be threatened by that, or he could learn from it. What followed stayed with everyone in the room. Long after the last note faded, they played together for another hour. Keith showed Jimi more open G voicings. Jimi showed Keith some finger stretches and standard tuning that Keith's hands couldn't quite manage but could approximate. They traded Robert Johnson verses. They dissected a Muddy Waters riff until they'd found its skeleton. But something had changed. Keith played differently now. More carefully. More thoughtfully. Like a man who just remembered there was always more to learn. At 4:30 in the morning, they finally stopped. The session musicians had left an hour before. Colin the engineer had long since given up pretending to have official duties and was simply sitting against the wall, bearing witness. As Jimi packed his guitar, Keith said, "What you did? With open G. Do you understand what that was?" Jimi looked up. "I played a tuning you showed me." "No," Keith said. "You did something else. You took something I've spent years with and you saw it cleaner than I do. You saw what it was under all my habits." Jimi closed his guitar case with a soft click. "Every tuning is a question. You've been asking that question for 8 years. I just heard it for the first time tonight, so I heard it different. Fresher. That's all. That's all," Keith repeated, shaking his head with a tired smile. Jesus. They walked out of the basement together as dawn was starting to gray the London sky. On the street, they shook hands. Keith's grip was firm, respectful. A different kind of handshake than when they'd met hours before. "Will you use it?" Keith asked. "Open G?" Jimi considered. "Maybe. If a song needs it. But I think—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "I think you're already saying what needs to be said in that tuning. I'll stay in my own house." Keith watched Jimi walk down the empty street, guitar case in hand, afro wild in the morning breeze. He stood there for a long time after Jimi had disappeared around a corner. When Keith got back to his flat, he pulled out his guitar and tried to play what Jimi had played. His fingers couldn't find it. The voicings were there, technically possible, but the meaning was gone. It had belonged to that moment. To that room. To Jimi. Keith never told that story publicly. But for the rest of his life, whenever someone asked him about Jimi Hendrix, Keith would pause before answering. In that pause lived the memory of a basement room at 3 in the morning, and the 10 seconds that taught him he was still a student. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. Colin the engineer kept that tape for 40 years. He never released it. He played it once for a music journalist who asked what Jimi was really like. The journalist listened in silence, then asked, "Why doesn't the world know about this?" Colin replied, "Because some moments aren't meant to be consumed. They're meant to be carried." The guitar Keith handed to Jimi that night is now in a private collection. The label inside reads, "The one Jimi played. Once was enough." Keith Richards never stopped playing open G. But he played it differently after that night. Listening harder. Leaving more space. Because Jimi Hendrix taught him something in 90 seconds that 8 years hadn't. Mastery isn't about knowing everything. It's about remaining open to hearing it new.